Fox News alert on growing drama in the Mueller investigation. The president's former attorney making a surprise appearance in federal court, pleading guilty to a new charge. Hello, everyone. I'm Dana Perino. This is the Daily Briefing. Michael Cohen admitting he lied to Congress about work he did on a Trump real estate deal in Russia. The president reacting to the news before leaving for the G20 summit in Argentina, calling Cohen a liar. On Twitter, the president also canceled his planned meeting with Vladimir Putin in Buenos Aires, citing the crisis in Ukraine. We have Fox team coverage. Doug McKelway, he's at the White House, but we begin with Catherine Herridge with more on the case. Catherine.
Well, thanks, Dana. Earlier today, we obtained a draft that was prepared by Cohen's attorneys for Congress in 2017. And that draft is at the heart of Cohen's guilty plea today, lying to Congress about the Moscow real estate proposal. Now, based on the new timeline provided by Cohen, the negotiations with Moscow continued well into the presidential campaign and during the same month of the controversial June 2016 Trump Tower meeting with Russian officials. Cohen told Congress, quote, the proposal was under consideration at the Trump Organization from September 2015 until the end of January 2016. They told the New York court this morning that it lasted another 5 months. Cohen also told Congress, quote, I never considered asking Mr. Trump to travel to Russia in connection with this proposal. To the best of my knowledge, Mr. Trump was never in contact with anyone about this proposal other than me on 2 occasions. But Cohen told the court earlier today the discussions were more extensive. Earlier today on Capitol Hill, the chairman and ranking Democrat of the Senate Intelligence Committee, who really matter here because it was their committee that got the original testimony from Cohen, responded to the plea.
There seems to be a trend here amongst so many of the president's closest allies that they don't tell the truth.
I haven't seen the specific indictment or the plea, but this is a reason people shouldn't lie when they're in front of a congressional investigation.
Critics of the Mueller probe say the Cohen plea is yet another example of what they call a process crime, and it's not evidence of coordination with Russian officials. But congressional Democrats are already saying that they're going to renew their investigation of Cohen in light of these new revelations. Dana.
All right, Catherine, thank you.
You're welcome.
Now to the White House and Doug McKelway with reaction from President Trump. Doug.
Good afternoon, Dana. We had expected a relatively slow day here at the White House, what with the president leaving for the G20 summit early this morning, but it turned out to be anything but that with the Michael Cohen plea deal. That when the president came out to talk to reporters, he didn't even bother to wait for any questions to be posed his way. Instead, he launched into an explanation that it was his right as a businessman to negotiate a hotel deal in Moscow because there was no guarantee that he would win the election. Recall that most people thought he would lose the election. He called his former trusted lawyer Cohen weak, a liar, and not very smart. When asked then why was he your lawyer, Mr. Trump said that Cohen had done him a favor many years ago, and then he said this about the Cohen plea deal.
Even if he was right, it doesn't matter, because I was allowed to do whatever I wanted during the campaign. I was running my business, a lot of different things during the campaign. So very simply, Michael Cohen is lying, and he's trying to get a reduced sentence for things that have nothing to do with me.
The president also told reporters that he would be briefed aboard Air Force One about the latest with the Russia-Ukrainian deal, conflict in the eastern part of Europe, which has raised tensions in that part of the world so much. And that no sooner had Air Force One been airborne when the president tweeted about that situation, quote, based on the facts that the ships and sailors have not been returned to Ukraine from Russia, I have decided it would be best for all parties concerned to cancel my previously scheduled meeting in Argentina with President Vladimir Putin. I look forward to a meaningful summit again as soon as this situation is resolved. And then shortly after that, the White House press office, again sending a message from Air Force One, said that there were more cancellations in store, announcing that meetings with Turkey and South Korea were also canceled. Trump instead, they said, would speak informally with leaders at G20. What's left, it appears, at least among the high-level meetings, is the Saturday night dinner meeting with President Xi of China. But now we have also learned that Peter Navarro, the hardline trade advisor, who is the author of the book Death by China, Confronting the Dragon, a Global Call for Action, will be in the delegation attending the dinner with President Xi. The bottom line is the Chinese simply do not like Mr. Navarro and what he stands for, which is to contain China. That, coupled with a new Reuters report that came out just this morning, that the U.S. government plans to more closely screen Chinese students who attend U.S. universities for the potential for spying, is casting a little bit of a pall on the prospects for any kind of a trade deal with China. It doesn't mean it's dead yet, Dana, but certainly casting a bit of a dark shadow on the prospects for a trade deal.
And we have Ian Bremmer from the Eurasia Group. He'll be here later on to talk to us about all of that. Thank you, Doug. Now let's bring in Jim Trusty, former DOJ prosecutor. So it's good to have you here today because, Trusty, I need you to explain what a false statement conviction really means.
Well, look, a false statement conviction, it's a serious federal crime. It kind of makes sense intuitively that you don't want people to lie to federal officials that are interviewing them about material, important things. It is a felony. It has the potential for jail. I think it's 5 years, if I remember correctly. But it's also, it is fair to call it a process crime. It's a situation where witnesses are not giving up the substance of what the investigation is actually focusing on, but instead tripping up on dishonesty. So it's not a great moment for the Mueller investigation to keep racking up false statement charges or maybe even convictions, because it's really getting further away from the core mission.
Well, true, but what do you think that, I mean, there seems to be a lot of lying going on.
Right. I mean, look, I think it's interesting to figure out when their discretion to charge this takes place. But the bottom line is, if you accept that these are actual provable instances, which certainly in Mr. Flynn's case he's pled, now Mr. Cohen has pled to a false statement charge. I think others have as well.
Papadopoulos.
You know, exactly. Then you get to a situation where you say, you know, even if it's not conspiratorial, man, you got a lot of people that are having a real hard time telling the truth, and and that certainly stokes the investigative engine in a way as well.
Let me read to you from the Washington Post today. It was said Cohen's new plea deal may only be the tip of the iceberg, and then Paul Waldman writes, Cohen is now admitting that he lied to Congress about some key matters involving his former boss, but the really important part isn't what's in the documents that have been released today, it's what isn't in them. Is he right about that?
Well, I'm not sure what he's referring to exactly, but let me put it to you this way. You know, if you have a cooperating witness who is an attorney who originally said, I'm going to take a bullet for my client, has now betrayed the client, will admit various felonies, including a false statement charge, which goes directly to his credibility. I mean, this is not a guy that you can build a case around. You can maybe build a report around him in part, but you better have an awful lot of corroboration if you're ever thinking about putting Mr. Cohen on a witness stand, because any defense attorney is going to have a heyday with him.
Then could we also talk about Paul Manafort, because that news was happened on Tuesday where the plea agreement broke down. What happens in a situation like that?
Well, it's an interesting process. You know, we hear that there's a breach, that the government's saying that he's broken the contract. And that's exactly how it works. It's like a contract. He's agreed to certain things, like cooperating fully and honestly, and they've agreed to certain things, concessions about his sentencing or his lack of further exposure. When you breach it, if you are proven to have breached the contract to a judge by a preponderance of the evidence, then the defendant loses all the good stuff but keeps the bad stuff. He still has been found guilty. He still pled guilty. He can't go back to square one. But the government no longer has any obligation to do anything. So they can basically try to bury him under the prison and max him out on his charges because he's in breach. But they have to prove it up to a judge by a preponderance, not by proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And that makes for interesting hearings. They see what the substance of those false statements are.
Then can you explain also the joint defense agreement and how that should have supposedly ended when Manafort entered his plea?
Yeah, I mean, typically, and these are all, it's another kind of contract. These are all unique in their own ways, but typically a joint defense agreement basically means a whole bunch of attorneys representing a bunch of clients that are in the same investigative probe have the protection of attorney-client privilege so they can speak freely. They want to get together and say, what's going on? Where's the prosecution going? What have they done recently? What's the investigator saying to your guy? If you are, if you find that your client's interests have become adverse to the rest of the team, normally you have to withdraw from the joint defense agreement because you're now on Team America, not on Team Defense. So it's a little unusual to hear about continued conversation between Manafort's attorneys and other people in the joint defense agreement because they have adverse interests now.
And as a former prosecutor, I would imagine that if you were in those shoes, you wouldn't be happy about that.
No, I would be thinking, what in the world is going on here? Because at least from my experience, they shouldn't be chit-chatting. Now, to their mild defense, if it's a very notorious, conspicuous case where everything's getting reported, maybe they feel like they can still have some conversation without really implicating privilege. But it's a dicey area.
All right, James Trusty, our trusty lawyer, thanks for being here today.
All right, see you, Dana.
President Trump's meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin, it's off. More details on what to expect at the G20 summit amid the growing Ukrainian-Russia crisis. Plus, as of this moment, Trump plans to meet with China's president. Will there be a truce in the trade wars?
I think we're very close to doing something with China, but I don't know that I want to do it, because what we have right now is billions and billions of dollars coming into the United States in the form of tariffs or taxes.
In these volatile markets, which investment are experts choosing for protection and
Fox News Alert, President Trump right now heading to the G20 summit in Argentina. Earlier today, he canceled his planned meeting with Vladimir Putin there. On Twitter, the president blamed the cancellation on the crisis in Ukraine, this coming only hours after his former attorney, Michael Cohen, pleaded guilty to lying to Congress. Joining me now is Ian Bremmer, president and founder of the Eurasia Group. So much to get to. I'm glad you're here because we have a lot to talk about. Let me first play for you some sound from the defense secretary about the crisis in Ukraine with Russia.
Sure.
Yeah, well, I think a cavalier force that injured Ukrainian sailors. It was contempt, really, for the traditional ways of settling these kinds of concerns. If they had any, it just shows that Russia cannot be counted on right now to keep its word.
So the meeting was on, then it was off, and now it was going to be on again, and now it is definitely going to be off. The president is not going to meet with Putin. Is that good news for Ukraine?
No, not really. Ukraine's in a tough position right now. There will be talk and support and probably additional directed sanctions, targeted sanctions against individuals and maybe companies, but nothing that's really going to force the Russians off of the dime here. The real problem is that Ukraine's president has 8% approval ratings and there are presidential elections coming up at the end of March, which he will lose. And so he is under much more pressure to escalate himself, or it's the end of his tenure in Ukraine.
And the Russians have said that that the Ukrainians provoked the situation because of these low approval ratings. Is there any merit to that?
Yeah, no one buys that. Secretary Mattis doesn't buy that. Donald Trump, I mean, though he's said it's both sides, he's also made clear that this is an unacceptable situation. The Russians here are engaging in a power play to squeeze the Ukrainians from the Sea of Azov, where almost 50% of all of their exports go out. So this is enormously problematic for Ukraine. But as we saw when Russia actually took Crimea and a significant piece of southeast Ukraine, the West, Ukraine is not a NATO member, and the West ultimately doesn't have a lot of interest in really promoting these guys.
Will anything happen at the G20 in regards to Ukraine?
I would be very surprised if Trump and Putin don't meet, at least informally. You'll remember you and I discussed the G20 in Hamburg a year ago that they, of course, spent almost an hour together at the dinner. They do get along. Trump actually gets along with a number of leaders at this G20. It's going to be by far the friendliest international summit to him, in part because of where the world has been going. A lot more nationalist leaders.
Does that include with China? We have a chart here from your group about just the enormous amount of trade that China and the United States do around the world. China there in red, the United States in blue. The president both saying that he's going to be real tough on them, but that he might be willing to deal. Is it important for China to try to get a deal with the president? Who needs this more?
It's more important to the Chinese than it is to the Americans, because the Chinese will be hurt a lot more if those tariffs continue to escalate against them. They're a smaller economy. They're more vulnerable to the Americans in that regard. The Chinese are coming to this meeting with an intention to try to get some kind of deal done, something that would be a statement of principles, nothing specific, but close to what the Americans and the North Koreans signed in Singapore, that would allow everyone to take a collective breath and step step back from continued escalation.
And then you have clear goals from the leadership, and then staff can then work towards those goals to try to get to a deal.
That's the hope. And there's certainly a possibility of that happening. The meeting has been set up with a long dinner and a private bilateral. It's been set up to be successful. But as you know, Peter Navarro, who's a hardliner on China, has just been re-invited to that meeting. The Chinese aren't going to like that. Vice President Pence, when he was in Papua New Guinea, sent there, I guess, for bad behavior a couple weeks ago, very far away, but gave a very strong statement against China. Trump is the kind of guy that will want to pull a rabbit out of its hat, want to show that only he and Xi Jinping, they're the only adults that could actually get something done. So that's a possibility. But as you know, he's just gotten maximally distracted by a lot of investigation-related news here in the U.S., and that's going to affect his mood.
But also at the G20, it's not the G7, right? This is the G20, so it's much expanded. And Saudi Arabia, the Crown Prince MBS will be there. Is he the pariah that everyone sort of has to kind of walk around?
Not everyone. The Chinese don't have a problem with him. The Russians don't have a problem with him. The French president actually has responded in a softer way.
But what about the Turkish president, Erdogan?
Well, no, but that's a geopolitical issue that doesn't have to do. I mean, the Turks are very good at killing journalists as well. The Saudis don't have a monopoly on that. Let's keep in mind that the issue of the Khashoggi murder, which is obviously one that no one should find remotely acceptable in an ally or in an enemy for that matter, has been radically outplayed because it's about the media and because about someone in particular that folks in the media really have an attachment to. So it's about them. There are lots of reasons to have problems with Saudi Arabia in terms of what they're doing in the region, like Yemen, like Qatar, like Lebanon. There are also lots of reasons to like Mohammed bin Salman because of what he was trying to accomplish domestically. All of those things are going to change now.
It's complex. My last question for you. Are you pro G20 or not? Like, this is a meeting that's relatively new in geopolitical circles, right? It's about 10 years old or something. Do you like it, or do you think it's too big for your purposes?
As someone who coined the term G0, where I mean, I'm constitutionally forbidden for saying that I really like the G20. But look, anytime you get leaders together in the world, you want them to engage. That's good. Let's keep in mind that this group of leaders has extremely little in common. And that's increasingly true over time. It's making it much harder.
And that's what you mean by the G0 world. Everyone should follow Ian Bremmer on Twitter. Got to check out G0 World.
Thank you, Dana.
Signal, the newsletter. I love it. Thanks, Ian Bremmer. We appreciate it.
See you soon.
So, how will the Trump administration handle the Michael Cohen news here in the United States from Argentina and the G20 summit? Karl Rove will tell us next. And what was Michael Cohen's demeanor from inside the courtroom this morning? We'll have a live report from downtown Manhattan. So here's my rule of thumb as a former White House press secretary. Every time a president goes overseas, some kind of crisis breaks out back home. Let's bring in Karl Rove, former White House deputy chief of staff and a Fox News contributor. Of course, he's no stranger to my rule of thumb. It seems to happen all the time, but that's what busy White Houses have to deal with, Karl. So today, Michael Cohen pleads guilty. The president calling him a liar just before he got on Marine One to head to Air Force One, where he's going to the G20 summit. How do you think the White House can best keep the trains moving on time for all the different things that a White House has to deal with?
Well, have the president focus his public comments and on the G20 and the issues surrounding it, and let somebody else be the voice of the president on this investigation. I think this should have been started a long time ago. I think the president would have been better served by it. I think Trey Gowdy had it right months ago when he advised Rudy Giuliani, the president's lawyer, if your client is innocent, let him act innocent, and that means keep him out of the conversation here.
Take a listen to Alan Dershowitz. He said something that I wanted to get your take on about the White House being prepared to issue some sort of counter-narrative after Mueller wraps up. Watch.
It's a prosecutorial report. It will not show balance. Anybody who expects balance, fairness, nuance is looking at the wrong kind of document. You can't have balance when you haven't heard the other side of the story, when you've only tried to put together a prosecutorial case. And that's why it's essential that the president's team be permitted to issue their own report at the same time the Mueller report is issued.
What do you think about that idea, Karl?
I think it's absolutely right. The president ought to be able to make his case at the same time, and to do so in a thoughtful, constructive, fulsome way, if you will. What I worry about is right now the White House counsel, Don McGahn, has left. His temporary replacement is Emmett Flood, whom you and I both know from our time in the White House. Very smart, very top-flight lawyer. The problem is that the White House counsel's office is about half the size that it ought to be, about 20-some-odd people when it should be 40 or 50 people. And preparing that kind of report, and Emmett's a very able guy and capable of very intense work, but that requires some assistance. And lots of things now are going to be pulling at him. As you and I both know, the White House counsel's office plays a role that most people don't understand, and it is one of the most power-packed and demanding places inside the West Wing.
Well, because, Carl, maybe you could just expand on that a little bit for the last question, which is, it's not just that there's a Mueller investigation, it's that the Democrats have already said that they want to investigate a lot of different things, and so that's another reason to maybe even, I think the Bush White House, we doubled the size of the counsel's office.
Yeah, well, after the Democrats took control in 2006, you're absolutely right. The size of the White House counsel's office doubled, and then we found out we hadn't hired enough lawyers. And my suspicion is that with 20-some-odd lawyers today and about ready to get a new general counsel, it's going to be very problematic for them to be ready on January 3rd to handle the onslaught that is coming their way. And again, I have the greatest respect for Emmett Flood. He's terrific, but you need to have a lot of really smart people in that office, and numbers matter when they face the kind of onslaught they're going to be facing in January from the Democrats.
All right. Karl Rove, we love having you. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
This is not a good development. Somebody conceding that they lied to Congress.
Lawmakers reacting to today's guilty plea from Michael Cohen. We are live on Capitol Hill with more from both parties. And how does this man, Jerome Corsi, fit into this entangled web? Hear what he had to say about the whole WikiLeaks email dump. Bombshell development in the Russia investigation. Former Trump attorney Michael Cohen making a surprise appearance in federal court, entering a new plea deal with special counsel Robert Mueller, admitting he lied to Congress. Fox team coverage, Rick Leventhal outside the courthouse in Manhattan. But let's begin with chief congressional correspondent Mike Emanuel with reaction on Capitol Hill. Mike?
Dana, good afternoon. Some Democrats say this is a sign that special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation is heating up.
Yeah, it certainly does because of Cohen's relationship with the president, but exactly what the lies were, and I guess that will come out when the plea is made. So, but it definitely feels like there's an accelerating pace now.
A key Intelligence Committee Republican says this proves the value of the work being done by Robert Mueller and his team.
That's obviously of great concern to me, and I'm very glad that the special counsel is pursuing those who mislead members of Congress. The Intelligence Committee has conducted numerous interviews of witnesses and made referrals where appropriate.
Some Democrats have pounced on the president's former personal lawyer, Michael Cohen, admitting he lied and are drawing their own conclusions.
This Cohen guilty plea is another piece in the mosaic that could really provide a deeper insight into the full picture of the president's liability here. Criminal culpability and conspiracy involving Michael Cohen have always been front and center.
This comes as a number of lawmakers from both parties want to pass a bill basically making sure that special counsel Mueller can complete his work.
Our job here should be to protect Robert Mueller so that he can do his job. And he can do his job not for him, but for the American people.
No surprise, members of both parties say there must be consequences if you lie to Congress. Dana?
Thank you, Mike. Michael Cohen pleaded guilty to other charges just a few months back, and Rick Leventhal has more on that from the U.S. District Court in New York City, where Cohen made his appearance earlier today. Rick, you were back at the courthouse this morning.
Yeah, and Dana, our producer, was in the courtroom this morning and said Cohen looked pretty relaxed, smiling and waving at people that he recognized in the courtroom, including our producer, who was sitting in the jury box, because the room was packed. So he seemed relaxed today. We also saw him back in August at another federal courthouse right around the corner when he pled guilty to bank and tax fraud charges related to a taxi business he owned, and also campaign finance violations for his help in orchestrating payments to two women, Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougal, who alleged that they had affairs with then businessman Trump years earlier and could have caused problems during the campaign. Cohen testified back in August that those payments were made, quote, in coordination with and at the direction of a candidate for federal office for the principal purpose of influencing the election. Cohen faces sentencing on those charges 2 weeks from now. Today's plea is totally separate and based on charges stemming from some 70 hours of interviews with members of Mueller's team, the special counsel's office. And this morning, Dana, we were tipped off to this particular court appearance being told that it was simply USA versus John Doe. Well, John Doe turned out to be Michael Cohen, and he told the court that he lied to a Senate and House committee to protect his former boss. Quote, I continue to follow the political messaging of individual one, who is Donald Trump, and his advisors. Cohen told the court, I asserted all efforts regarding the Moscow project ceased in January 2016, when in fact they kept going until June of 2016. Cohen also told the judge, I said I never contemplated travel or spoke to individual one, again, that's referring to President Trump, regarding travel, but I did. And Cohen did not answer questions on his way out of the court this morning. His attorney said Cohen has cooperated and will continue to cooperate. And his sentencing on this charge today, Dana, could be wrapped into the sentencing for those other charges. Again, a couple of weeks from now, and we're told he faces several years in prison on all of the charges. So he could do some serious time.
All right, Rick, thank you so much.
Everybody in the world who was in news or political operations after July 22nd, when Assange, 2016, when Assange dumped all these emails on Debbie Wasserman Schultz, said he had more, everybody wanted to know what they were.
You wanted them out, though, to help the Trump campaign.
Absolutely.
That was Jerome Corsi, an associate of Roger Stone, saying last night he tried to get in touch with WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange to find out the contents of DNC emails hacked by the Russians in hopes of using it against the Hillary Clinton campaign. Fox News senior judicial analyst Andrew Napolitano saying Robert Mueller's theory on collusion is starting to come into focus.
Well, the roadmap appears to run through Jerry Corsi and perhaps through Roger Stone, and through the Julian Assange, and perhaps through the president of Ecuador, and perhaps through Paul Manafort, in an effort to, this is Bob Mueller's theory now, not mine, show a circuitous route of communication between Russian hackers getting into the DNC and the Hillary campaign computers and delivering that information to the public.
I'm joined now by Doug Burns. He's a former federal prosecutor, and so good to have you here for your expertise. There's just one other character that I want to bring into this, and that's Felix Sater.
Yes.
This quote is coming back. This is from a New York Times report in August of 2017, where Felix Sater sends an email to Michael Cohen, in which he says, our boy, meaning President Trump, can become president of the USA, and we can engineer it. I will get all of Putin's team to buy in on this. I will manage this process. But tell me a little bit about Felix Sater.
Well, that's pretty powerful, but Felix Sater's got a little bit of a checkered past. If you look at his background and his history, he's had some situations, legal problems, was indicted, and so forth. But again, as working off what Judge Napolitano was saying, I mean, I personally, Dana, I look at this one of two ways, just logically. If I were sitting in a conference room in the U.S. Attorney's Office with a supervisor, I would say, boss, here's the way I see it. Okay, you've got Roger Stone, and then you have Corsi on the one hand, with an ostensible possible link to, WikiLeaks, okay? And then you have an ostensible link between Stone and Corsi and the Trump campaign. But, boss, we haven't put those two sides together yet, and the only way we're going to prevail on some type of concrete theory that the Trump campaign worked specifically with the Russians to affect the election is if we can put that together, and we're not there yet. So everybody needs to calm down a little bit, Dana. Everybody wildly theorizing. But again, in fairness, and working again off Judge Napolitano, at least now they seem to have a viable global concept and theory of WikiLeaks disseminating DNC emails that were hacked, Stone and Corsi possibly linked to them, and then a link on the reverse side to the Trump campaign. You're starting to get lukewarm, so to speak.
And then you had this report that was out of The Guardian that has not been corroborated by any other reporter, so they're not actually reporting it. So I think maybe we should take that with a bit of skepticism about Manafort going to visit Assange.
And I'm very glad you mentioned that real quick, because one thing I've learned in 33 years of doing this, every day I was a federal prosecutor, 9 years, been in a lot of witness interviews, is that the denials were very, very clear and unequivocal, okay, about how we never met with Assange, we had nothing to do with him, and those seem quite credible. So I think it leans slightly toward Mueller trying to finalize.
And maybe could it be that Mueller finalizes, and what he finalizes is that there's a lot of people that were involved in this in some way that all lied, but we're not coming up with any sort of collusion that ties the president to it, and so there's our report. Is that
No, I think that's a very good crystal ball prediction. I think that, I've said this before, I'll say it again, it's interesting. You're going to see the reliance on, look, there are 2 DOJ memos that say you can indict the president. That provides an immediate cover and an immediate segue. But by the way, there are a lot of things that went on that did appear to be somewhat, shady and so on. This connection, that connection, the cast of characters. But there's no indictable crime.
My last question to you is that it is a crime to lie to the FBI and to lie to Congress. I mean, there should be consequences for that.
It's a 5-year felony, 18 USC 1001.
Yeah, don't do that. And it costs a lot of money to defend yourself.
Absolutely.
Right. All right. Doug Burns, love having you. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Swift reaction on Capitol Hill after Michael Cohen admits he lied to a Senate committee. Senator John Kennedy is on deck with his reaction. And be sure to check out my podcast with Chris Stirewalt. It's called I'll Tell You What. It's available for download on iTunes or wherever you listen.
Michael Cohen pleading guilty in a Manhattan federal court to lying to Congress. The former personal attorney to the president admitted he made false statements to lawmakers about a plan to build a Trump Tower in Moscow. Cohen's plea, his second in the past 4 months, comes as part of a new deal with special counsel Robert Mueller and the investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election. President Trump went after Cohen before leaving for the G20.
He was convicted of various things unrelated to us. He was given a fairly long jail sentence, and he's a weak person. And by being weak, unlike other people that you watch, he's a weak person, and what he's trying to do is get a reduced sentence. So he's lying about a project that everybody knew about. I decided ultimately not to do it. There would have been nothing wrong if I did do it.
Meanwhile, we are learning more about the president's written answers to the special counsel as he continues to hammer out an investigation that has hung over his presidency for some 18 months. Chief Intelligence Correspondent Catherine Herridge with the news from Washington. Catherine?
Well, thank you, Harrison. Good afternoon. This draft prepared by Cohen's attorneys for Congress in 2017 is at the heart of Cohen's guilty plea this morning about this Moscow real estate proposal that never went through. As Cohen left a New York court this morning, he did not stop to take reporters' questions about the apparent conflict. In the draft for Congress in 2017, Cohen said negotiations over the Trump-Moscow project ended in January of 2016. But he told a New York court today it was, in fact, 5 months later in June of 2016. In the draft, Cohen said the discussion about traveling to Moscow was limited and it was never raised with then-candidate Trump. But Cohen told the New York court the discussions were, in fact, more extensive. On Capitol Hill a short time ago, the chairman and the ranking member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, that committee matters because they got the testimony from Cohen in the first place, reacted to the plea.
I'm not going to comment upon the commentary that this individual made before our committee. We've kept that confidential, but obviously Mr. Cohen was one of the witnesses that we've always wanted to have come back, and that need goes up.
I haven't seen the specific indictment or the plea, but this is a reason people shouldn't lie when they're in front of a congressional investigation.
Before the Cohen story broke this morning, the president renewed his criticism of the Robert Mueller probe, tweeting, "When will this illegal Joseph McCarthy-style witch hunt, one that has shattered so many innocent lives, ever end? or will it just go on forever? After wasting more than $40 million, it has proven only one thing. There was no collusion with Russia. So ridiculous. And we're also learning today more about the president's written answers to Mueller. They were submitted just within the last couple of weeks. Sources tell Fox News that the president said he did not know about the 2016 Trump Tower meeting in advance, that Roger Stone did not tell him about any contact with WikiLeaks, and that he was also not aware of the RNC platform change regarding the Ukraine. So that's a lot to unpack, but that's where we stand on this very busy news day, Harris.
Before I let you go, because this is something I didn't get to ask you last hour, how do we know all this information? I mean, when you talk about a leak, do we know how?
A leak, sorry, with
the questions and the, I mean, are we learning just that in kind of context, or do we actually know what's being asked?
Okay, so we know that the submitted questions from the special counsel dealt with the issues surrounding allegations of Russian collusion. They did not deal with what I'll call obstruction of justice, which would be, some argue, the firing of the FBI Director James Comey. What's happened really in the last 72 hours is that there have been a series of leaks about the substance of the president's written answers to the special counsel. CNN got that story first. We were able to corroborate some of that reporting. And in the last few minutes, I've spoken with a source close to the legal team, and I asked whether the Cohen plea today has any impact on the written responses provided by the president. And I was told that the legal team remains confident with the written answers that were provided. So it doesn't change their calculus at this point.
Oh, thank you for digging deeper on that. Catherine
You're
Herridge,
welcome.
and spelling it out for us. Good to see you.
Sure.
Let's bring in now Republican Lee Zeldin of New York. I kind of felt like you deposing her there. The congressman sits on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, maybe even asking some of the questions that you might ask, Congressman. Thank you for being with me. What does this tell us about the Mueller investigation?
Well, for one, the president, who has personal knowledge that he didn't do anything wrong, he continues to cooperate. He's answering questions. A lot of documents have been provided. This investigation appears to be going well beyond, with this ever-expanding scope that is a lot further than the purpose for appointing the special counsel in the first place. The president is ready for this investigation to end, but what's more important than that is our country is ready for it to end. So the Mueller investigation hopefully is one that will be winding down soon, because it really is improper for there to be an investigation like this throughout the entire time that President Trump is in office. I, as a member of Congress, I'm serving this is the end of my 4th year now. I'm not aware of any evidence whatsoever that the president had colluded with the Russians. So until we come in contact with any information whatsoever, the justification for not only continuing this investigation, but also expanding the probe, like what we're seeing, well beyond of why it was created in the first place, we have a lot of members of Congress who have a problem with that too.
All right, Michael Cohen, were you surprised at all about the entry of a guilty plea, if you will, that he put in this morning, lying to Congress?
Well, what strikes me about it is that Mueller's star witness has now admitted to being a liar criminally. And I'm a former prosecutor, and looking for facts and elements of a crime, I see so much that is missing about what gets alleged maybe in the news, or those who want to take down the president, who are desperate, who are praying to take down the president and his family. There's so much that is missing here, and now you have a star witness who has less credibility than he did yesterday, and an investigation that has less credibility than it did yesterday. And it seems like one indictment and guilty plea after another of what we're seeing it is getting away from the heart of why this special counsel was created in the first place, and that was for there to be accountability and transparency with regards to whether or not the Russians interfered with the 2016 election, and so much of the crimes that get pursued are completely unrelated to the Trump campaign, and a lot of what is taking down these individuals, like what we're seeing today with Michael Cohen, is with regards to lying. And by the way, regardless of whether it's this case or any other case, and you just had Senator Kennedy share his thoughts in that segment, in the last segment, is whether you're talking to Congress, you're talking to the Department of Justice, it's really important to be honest, because if you lie, you're going to get in trouble for it.
Yeah, I spoke with Senator Kennedy last night on the story, and that's exactly what he was saying. Real quickly before I let you go, how do you make a deal with what you call a criminal liar? I mean, he's striking yet another deal. And is it significant that he's doing it in your state of New York or in any state?
Well, with regards to that piece, geography and jurisdiction, is that you don't need a special counsel to be going after so much of what it appears Bob Mueller is looking into now. The Department of Justice can handle that on its own. And also, why, with Jeff Sessions, he's left the Department of Justice. The reason why this was created really started with, it stemmed from a recusal made by Jeff Sessions as the Attorney General. So now let's get back to normalcy within the Justice Department. Let's have an Attorney General who's in charge of the DOJ, because to your point on jurisdiction and geography, and this happening in New York, this really can be happening all under the normal chain of command of the Department of Justice, as opposed to making the special counsel even bigger than it was before.
Does Michael Cohen lessen the years in prison that he might have to spend by doing this deal making?
Probably. I mean, that's probably the whole motive for doing it in the first place, is to be able to get favorable treatment. And there's a lot that Michael Cohen has gotten in trouble with that's completely unrelated to President Trump. This was Michael Cohen's own actions, and he looks like he's cutting a deal to get favorable treatment for himself, even if that might be harming a president of the United States. It might be embarrassing our justice system. It's Michael Cohen doing what's best for Michael Cohen, regardless of the consequences. That's unfortunate.
Yeah, I don't know. I had not heard anybody put it the way you did, criminal liar. How do you trust that person? How do you cut a deal with somebody like that?
No